No, it's really, really nice. I was here a while ago and I've been wanting to come back ever since and really sort of talk to and collaborate with more of you. But yeah, it really has been quite difficult the past 2 years. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm just excited and incredibly honoured to be here and to have the chance to talk to you about my work on democracy and the ethics of voting and its relationship to my research, which is the topic of my talk today, about elections and sortition. However, I hope you don't mind if at the end of the talk I ask for your help in thinking about some questions about democratic equality that I'm beginning to formulate for myself and worry about. And in the interests of social solidarity, I thought I'd share with you. I figure burdens shared are always best. So let me start by saying a little bit about how I got into research on the ethics of voting, before turning to the appeal of sortition as a democratic way to select people for power and authority. And I'll then close briefly with some thoughts about the way the two are related and some questions. Because I started research on the ethics of voting with other things in mind, it took me a while to realize how little had been written on the topic, or how odd it might seem to talk about voting as an ethical matter. After all, one might think, the really important question is to know why citizens should have a right to vote, an equal right to vote, even if they're not particularly wise, virtuous, knowledgeable, patriotic, and the rest of it, rather than what they should do with the vote that democracies have given them. In fact, rather embarrassingly, it was only a year or two before I first came to Aalborg that the ethics of voting, that I started really to think about these latter questions. Although I briefly considered the subject 10 years earlier, when I started to work on Mill's arguments against the secret ballot. If the coercion and suppression of politically unpopular people and views are likely, the secret ballot's going to be justified as a contribution to democracy. Mill assumed that to be true. However, he came to believe that the threat of political coercion and intimidation was no longer so great in the Britain of his day as to justify secret rather than open voting, given that the former makes it impossible for citizens publicly to challenge each other to justify their political beliefs and decisions. So, convinced that open voting should be the democratic norm, and that circumstances no longer justify departures from it, Mill eventually abandoned his earlier defence of the secret ballot, a defence he had shared with his father, James Mill, as with Jeremy Bentham. Of course, in order to defend the secret ballot, we can simply assume that Mill got his facts wrong and was perhaps characteristically too optimistic about our capacities to be reasonable in the face of the stupidity, ill will, and even viciousness of others. But I was curious whether we should concede that open voting is preferable to secret voting if we care about democracy. Instead, I came to think the deeper justification of the secret ballot is the way it underlines and instantiates a crucial democratic idea, that all citizens are entitled to participate as equals in politics, whether or not their views meet with the approval of others. The fact that the secret ballot might stop people being coerced or manipulated is obviously a democratic plus. But, so I came to believe, the expressive and symbolic importance it has would be sufficient to justify it, whether or not it served any other function. However, while I wanted to reject Mill's assumptions about the democratic priority of secret and open voting, it seemed important to insist with him that voting isn't just a matter of personal preference, lacking ethical content or significance of its own. Individually, our votes can't change anything, but taken together, they serve to legitimize this rather than that government. While governments often fail to achieve what they set out to do, and as we know, sometimes don't want to achieve what they promised, the fact that our vote can have this decisional and legitimating power makes it morally irresponsible to ignore its impact on others, particularly on those who can't vote, such as children, future generations, foreigners, and non-human animals. And so, agreeing with Mill that there's an ethical dimension to voting, potentially a very significant one, but disagreeing with him that open voting, not just open political debate, is therefore justified. I started to think about the implications of my arguments for compulsory voting, or our claims not to exercise our right to vote. One of my worries with Mill's case against the secret ballot was that it seemed to confuse the idea that people have a right to vote with the idea that voting is a duty we owe to others. Mill explicitly framed his arguments in terms of the wrongness of seeing voting as a right rather than a duty, suggesting that if we think of voting as a right, there'd be no objection to selling our votes to the highest bidder. However, in other chapters of his consideration on representative government, as in his magisterial demolition of arguments for the subjection of women, Mill made it clear that he thought workers and women are entitled to vote, and that it's an injustice to them whether or not it's an injustice to other people when they're denied that right. So while Mill's arguments against the secret ballot suggested that open voting should be the democratic default, because voting is a duty we owe to others, and therefore they must be able to assess our performance of it, the premises of his argument fit badly with his stated conviction that it's unjust to deny people the right to vote once they can use that right to protect their own interests, whether or not doing so will protect the interests of others. More seriously, I think, the idea that your interests in self-protection and self-development, as Mill called them, are irrelevant to your rights as a voter, flies in the face of democratic premises about politics. Democracy means we can't simply treat your claims to vote or to participate in politics more generally as an extension of your duties to others, because that would imply that your well-being and your rights have no bearing on the subject. So while there's something wrong with an idea of rights that implies you should be able to sell your vote, it's one thing to say that we have duties to others that affect what we should do with our vote, and another to suppose that your claims to vote are simply a function of your duty to others. Now, if these points are correct, then the difficulties with Mill's case for open voting has implications for debates about mandatory voting too, as I came to realise. Put colloquially, forcing people to vote means saying, you can be required to benefit others by voting, even if voting isn't in your own interests as you see them. Or it amounts to saying, we don't believe you know what's best for you, and so we'll force you to vote because it's good for you, whether or not that harms other people or causes you care about. Now, neither of those statements, it seems to me, fit with the idea that you have the moral rights and capacities that justify ascribing political rights to you. So the reasons to reject open voting look like reasons to reject compulsory voting and compulsory turnout too. Although compulsory turnout means you don't actually have to cast a ballot, rather than just turn up at the voting booth, the justification for forcing people to turn up, even if they don't want or intend to vote, is premised on the same assumptions as compulsory voting, namely, either that you don't know what's good for you, or that what's good for you is less important than what's good for other people. So in exceptional circumstances, perhaps, compulsory voting might be justified, perhaps to protect the weak in situations where the state is weak. So, for example, one of the standard cases might be in Latin America, where indigenous populations are actually incredibly vulnerable to coercion. The state can't really get there to protect them. So maybe forcing people to vote has a protective value, enabling them to exercise their right to vote, which they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. The other justification, perhaps, is that, especially when you're moving in situations of conflict to democracy, finding a form of proportional representation that everyone can sign up to may require unusually high levels of voting. And so to secure that, perhaps, there's a case for compulsory voting too. But these seem to me exceptional circumstances, and therefore, as a general matter, I take it that open voting is inconsistent with democracy, and that the reasons why it is are reasons to reject compulsory voting and turnout too. Now, shocking as it might seem, my claims about the democratic difficulties of open voting and compulsory voting haven't met with universal approval. In fact, a recent doctoral student at Aalborg, Rasmus Uhrenfeld, clearly thinks that my views on the secret ballot pay insufficient attention to our duties to others and to the importance of accountability that open voting permits, but secret ballot precludes. I regret to say that he isn't the only person who disagrees with me in these matters. So, having left the secret ballot and compulsory voting aside for several years in order to concentrate on the ethical criteria that might guide our vote and the democratic importance of moral permissions more generally, I thought it was time to actually start looking at these objections to the secret ballot all over again. And then I discovered that there was another debate on democracy that might make this completely pointless. Because according to some philosophers and political scientists, voting just isn't a democratic way to select people for positions of power and authority, and should be replaced by sortition or random selection. If right, there'd be no gain to democratic theory or practice in reconsidering whether voting should be secret or not. And quite possibly, it was a mistake for any of us to have spent so much time worrying about these things in the first place. Now, I'm quite a lazy person. So ordinarily, if someone tells me that I don't need to read a whole lot of stuff on the secret ballot and accountability that I've actually been putting off for quite a while, my initial reaction would be, yippee, this is great. And I was also intrigued by the sound of these arguments on sortition. Because in my work on compulsory voting, I've always emphasised that elections are not the only democratic way to participate in politics, that obsessing about people as voters at the cost of attending to their claims to rule is a mistake, and that more direct participation by citizens, including through randomly selected assemblies, is democratically desirable. In fact, in 2010 to 11, I'd written an enthusiastic, although not uncritical piece, on the Citizens' Council established by NICE, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence in the UK, which used randomly selected citizens to help it think about the rationing of healthcare. In the past couple of years, I'd also been thinking about the importance of lay magistrates and randomly selected juries in helping us to see ourselves and to act as rulers. So the idea that sortition could have a useful place in democracies and that citizens must be able to deliberate and decide with strangers as equals, all of these were things I've long endorsed. But none of that, so far as I could see, depended on accepting that the Greeks were right to believe random selection more democratic than elections, let alone that we could improve our evidently defective democracies by replacing our legislative bodies with a bunch of randomly selected citizens. And so, before reconsidering the case for open voting, it seemed necessary to consider whether elections, even with universal suffrage and equally weighted votes, have much, if anything, to do with democracy. Now, in his wonderful The Principles of Representative Government, Bernard Manin reminded his readers that the association of representative government with democracy is relatively new, not simply because elections with universal suffrage are a recent phenomenon, but because the ancient and Renaissance republics considered elections to be an aristocratic, not a democratic way to select people for positions of power. Elections were considered aristocratic because they enabled voters to select those they thought best suited or best qualified for rule, and to choose them again and again if they so wished. By contrast, Manin explained, lotteries were thought of as democratic selection devices because they gave everyone the same chance of holding office, and when repeated, were likely to favour the rotation of people in power, thereby militating against the creation of a political elite. However, until recently, no one seems to have thought that this meant that elections, even with universal suffrage, are less democratic than sortition, or that it would be a gain for democracy if people replaced one or more of their legislative bodies with randomly chosen citizens. So, what can be said in favour of the democratic credentials of sortition? bearing in mind that the use of lotteries, often in conjunction with elections, was used to prop up oligarchical regimes in the Renaissance republics of Venice and Florence, and even as recently as the late 19th century in the case of Bern. The obvious point, and the one cited repeatedly by contemporary fans of random selection, is the idea that lotteries, when suitably constructed, answer to the democratic idea that people are equally entitled to participate in politics and to take part in ruling as well as being ruled. The equal opportunity to hold office created by unweighted lotteries, as well as the rotation in office that they promise, seem to speak directly and in an intuitively appealing way to the idea that democratic citizens are each entitled to take part in government and are in principle interchangeable as equals in their claims to power and responsibility. Where it's impossible to share a good equally, random selection amongst claimants preserves a commitment to treating them as equals by avoiding invidious, destructive and unfair comparisons amongst them. When justified by randomization, unequal rewards don't impugn the virtues, capacity, status, needs or desires of those who lose out, and therefore provide no grounds for arrogance on the part of winners or self-abasement on the part of losers. So it seems unweighted lotteries are the democratically ideal way to distribute goods, including political office, to which all have an equal claim, but which it's impossible or undesirable to share amongst everyone at once. Some additional considerations about randomization are also relevant here. Where the randomly selected body is sufficiently large compared to the total population, and where everyone selected participates, unweighted lotteries create assemblies that are a microcosm of the larger whole. That is, the randomly selected assembly, though smaller than the whole, will be made up of different groups in proportion to their numbers in the population. This will be true for invisible as well as visible characteristics, and for their ascriptive as well as for their voluntary ties with others. It will therefore be possible to treat the smaller group as an exact replica of the larger one, and an accurate replacement for it for some purposes. Although randomization with smaller bodies is likely to result in clusters that mean the smaller group won't be a microcosm of the whole, as long as the assembly is large enough relative to the total population, that problem vanishes, for the same reason that over a large enough number of coin tosses, you're going to get heads 50% of the time coming up, whereas in smaller ones, you may well get tails all the time, or something like that. So randomization can be compatible with microcosmic selection, or descriptive representation as it's now called. Thus, without having to make any politically controversial decisions about who or what deserves to be represented, those who haven't been selected by a random draw can be confident there'll be people like them in their assembly, and in numbers proportionate to their total in the population. In these ways, so it seems, individually equal opportunities to be selected for the assembly will coexist with and generate equality of results in the representation of everyone's visible and invisible, voluntary and descriptive characteristics. Put otherwise, while randomization in these circumstances still means that many, probably most of us, will not be part of a legislative body, we'll know that we had the same chance as everyone else to be selected, and that despite our absence, we will be represented by others who think, feel, and live and look like us in numbers that represent our frequency in the population. So you can see, it just does look immensely appealing. But unfortunately, for reasons both of relative size and people's willingness and ability to participate, it's impossible to create deliberative assemblies that preserve both an equal opportunity for individuals to be selected and microcosmic or descriptive representation. Unweighted lotteries standardly create assemblies that don't look at all like the citizen body, both because they're too small for all the different characteristics of citizens to be represented proportionately, and because citizens are often unwilling or unable to participate, even if selected. Both problems are non-trivial. Evidence from larger citizen assemblies, such as the Scottish Assembly on climate change, suggests that only 3% of those initially invited responded positively to the invitation. And while much higher proportions have been found for smaller and less onerous assemblies, around 40%, that seems to be the highest, the existing average positive response rate across all assemblies is 15%. We may hope with Guerrero that high salaries, help relocating, and other forms of support and encouragement might persuade people selected at random to take on the onerous responsibilities of a legislative body. But realism suggests that most people are unlikely to want to devote large amounts of their time to politics, even for a relatively finite period, and to disrupt their professional and personal relationships in order to shoulder responsibilities for which they may have no taste or affinity. In such circumstances, equal opportunity for individuals comes at the cost of the equal representation of groups, understood as the proportionate representation of people's visible and invisible, ascriptive and voluntary ties to others. So it looks as though we're going to have to choose between equal opportunity for individuals, unweighted lotteries, and equality of results or group representation, the two things that made random selection look so appealing. Under modern circumstances where populations are too large for everyone to participate together, it's impossible to see how equal opportunity amongst individuals and the equal representation of groups are to be preserved. For the same reason that short runs of coin tosses with tails on top are statistically possible, even probable. The problem's exacerbated but not created by a commitment to voluntary participation, in that the unequal representation of groups that voluntariness creates is likely to be skewed heavily towards the more confident, politically motivated, and those with time and resources to devote themselves to politics rather than to personal professional matters. So the impartiality that gives randomization its egalitarian appeal looks significantly less democratic once formally equal opportunities become the means by which unequal life chances are translated more or less directly into our legislative bodies. Moreover, the rationale for using lotteries rather than other means to create legislative bodies will seem much less egalitarian when we're not selecting, as were the Greeks, amongst a bunch of volunteers with equal claims on power, rather than from a mixed bag of people, some of whom see office as a burden and others as an opportunity to be welcomed. Lotteries are a fair way to distribute burdens amongst a group of people who are equally likely to bear them. That's the case with military service. Just as they can be a fair way to distribute goods and opportunities with equal claims on them. But when we're dealing with a population who disagree about the value of the good to be distributed, this egalitarian rationale for using lotteries vanishes. So the random selection of citizens to assemblies doesn't enable us to avoid the dilemmas dogging elections and appointment, namely, how to evaluate the relative importance of equal opportunity for individuals as opposed to groups, whether formally equal opportunities for office have any democratic value at all. Faced with the predictable consequences of unweighted lotteries, it's scarcely surprising that most citizen assemblies use weighted, not unweighted lotteries to determine their membership. They must therefore give up the claim to be democratic because they give everyone the same chance to be selected, and instead rest their democratic credentials on the claim that stratified sampling means we can construct randomly selected assemblies that look like us, at least in certain respects. Unfortunately, clarity about this trade-off and the choices made isn't common in the literature, where it's still customary to assert that sortition assemblies are both descriptively representative and secure equal opportunity for individuals. Still, the ability to combine randomization with an assembly that looks like us does have democratic appeal, even if the justification of the quotas used for sampling is no more self-evident or self-evidently justified than the use of quotas and specially weighted votes in elected and appointed bodies. At present, the stratified sampling used to create citizen assemblies is generally based on characteristics such as age, sex, education, geography, and income. However, in the UK, it's common to stratify based on ethnicity as well. And the climate assemblies in the UK, as distinct from the one in France, also stratified based on people's opinion on climate change. The key point, however, is that given the small size of most assemblies relative to the population, and a large assembly here is an assembly made up of 200 to 300 people, a small one will be smaller than 50. Stratification simply can't ensure the proportionate representation of the whole population. The construction of the lottery, therefore, must involve some morally and politically significant choices about who does and doesn't deserve proportionate representation to the assembly. And these decisions are likely to be more consequential and controversial in future, because as is true for elections and appointments, groups who aren't represented proportionately are unlikely to be represented at all. Bearing these considerations in mind, then, it seems that the democratic appeal of randomly selected assemblies consists in this: that they enable citizens who are strangers to each other to come together as equals to deliberate on matters of collective importance based on shared access to the best available evidence. Now, this, as I see it, is of enormous importance and quite enough to justify using them. So too is the fact that organisers and theoreticians of sortition assemblies now spend a lot of time trying to make the process of deliberation as inclusive and supportive as possible, even though I think a lot remains to be done in this respect. However, when one considers the two forms of equality that gave sortition its appeal, its democratic appeal, the equal chance to be selected and the equal representation of voluntary and ascriptive groups, one must conclude that the appeal is more apparent than real. There are all sorts of ways in which we can create assemblies that look like us, from a very small and atypical bunch of volunteers. The use of sortition is merely one. We can use proportional, reserved seats, various forms of proportional representation, sometimes cumulative voting, and of course standard forms of affirmative action, outreach and support. Those are all ways to turn a bunch of untypical volunteers into an assembly that looks like us. It's an open question then, what moral, political, or indeed epistemic value we should attribute to randomly selected assemblies, even if they do look like us. The same, of course, could be said of representative bodies created by elections or appointments, but with this difference, that in their case, those authorised to decide who should govern on our behalf can compare the merits of volunteers through an open evaluative process. Such considerations may be insufficient to prefer elections and appointment to sortition. However, because we find it hard enough to protect each other's equality, freedom and rights when we deliberately try to do so, we may have reasons to prefer choice to chance and the selection of our legislatures, as of our military and our medical personnel, imperfect and qualified though our choices may be. Sortition has many values then as a way to distribute benefits and burdens amongst equals, when neither rotation or sharing is possible. Its unpredictability makes favouritism harder, even impossible. And this can be true even when weighted lotteries are used to distribute benefits and burdens amongst a large group of people. Unweighted lotteries give everyone the same chance of being selected, and that can be appealing in cases where formal equality of opportunity is a preeminent good. Weighted lotteries enable forms of proportionality, which can be appealing in cases where formal equality of opportunity is either irrelevant or seems less significant in ensuring certain types of equality of outcome. However, while weighted lotteries can enable us to pattern random outcomes in ways that reflect our values, they can't ensure substantively equal opportunities for individuals or for groups, as they do nothing to change the unfairness in people's circumstances, which prevent them from taking up the opportunities they're offered, and sometimes even for recognizing something as an opportunity in the first place. The forms of descriptive representation that lotteries create, then, don't change the unequal circumstances facing individuals, and may unfortunately hide and justify them, at least as long as participation is voluntary, not compulsory. If our assemblies look like microcosms of our society, an answer to some idea of fair representation amongst groups, it's easy to forget that this fairness can be created by purely statistical means, with no bearing on the substantive opportunities that people face. The designers of citizen assemblies now make every effort to facilitate the participation of those who would otherwise find it difficult. The organisers of NICE, for example, bought transport tickets for people, arranged and paid for childcare, and did all sorts of other things just to really encourage people to be able to take part. It's possible then to supplement statistical finesse with forms of support that reduce inequalities in the ability to participate of those who've been selected. And perhaps that has some effect on the opportunities of other people too. That would be welcome, though the consequence of such interventions is likely to be small, even for those who have been selected, and probably next to invisible for everyone else. So, randomly selected citizen assemblies can be a contribution to democratic practice and theory, even if their credentials are very much weaker than is claimed by their proponents. It's important that citizens have numerous and varied opportunities to participate with others in considering public policy and in providing a considered opinion on the performance of their government, of the public officials, and in fact of their constitution. Citizen assemblies then can be important contributions to informed public opinion, to the deliberation of others, whether professional or lay. And they can provide a means by which public resources are used to educate citizens and to involve them in politics. There are lots of different ways in which citizen assemblies might be created and their deliberations organised. And the results of their deliberations can be presented in lots of different ways, many more than is customary at the moment. And I think all of these things will be true once it's clear that the current ways of choosing them, which are obsessed with, on the one hand, equal opportunity and equality of results, once we realise that that just isn't so important, it looks as though there are going to be lots and lots of different ways in which we can try to create randomly selected citizen bodies to deliberate on matters of public policy. But from what we've seen, democratic principles don't justify ascribing significant decisional power to random bodies. And there's no reason at present to suppose they can substitute for elections and the creation of democratic legislatures. Indeed, surprising as it might seem, the questions about secrecy, voluntariness, accountability, equality and legitimacy that characterize the philosophical literature on voting are likely to find their place in the theory and practice of sortition assemblies too, once more progress is made in considering their democratic appeal. Unanimity in deliberative assemblies is unlikely when people are free to dissent and have no prior reasons to agree with each other, as is the case when they're selected at random. The willingness publicly to accept or reject a particular decision, opinion or person, therefore, remains, and with it the need to consider the merit of majority rule as compared to other ways of closing deliberation, and of allowing minority or dissenting opinions as opposed to one opinion for all, which is the current practice. Above all, insofar as citizen assemblies, however constituted, seek to contribute to public debate on behalf of other citizens, rather than as members of partisan groups, deeper reflection on the relationship between their procedures and their outcomes is unavoidable, as is the evaluation of both procedures and outcomes in terms of democratic values and experience. The ethics of voting, then, is relevant to the construction of sortition assemblies as to elected and appointed ones. The ways in which we create democratic assemblies has implications for the permissions, prohibitions, and obligations that members face, whether they're selected randomly, appointed, or elected. In turn, the incentives and disincentives to good behaviour created by these constitutive and operative rules affect members' ability to cooperate as equals and to be seen as peers rather than aliens, servants or rulers by those who are not members. However, the ready reference to Athenian democracy by proponents of sortition can obscure the importance and difficulty of deciding what constitutive and operative rules sortition assemblies might use. If that's all right, I'm coming to the end. I thought I was meant to talk for 60 minutes, not 45. In democratic Athens, all citizens were entitled to participate in the lawmaking body. The use of lotteries, therefore, was reserved for additional public offices for which citizens could volunteer. And these offices were largely individual, with the exception of juries, where lots of people could participate. Now, these points, I think, are just of fundamental importance, because both lotteries and appointment in Athens coexisted with the preeminence of a lawmaking assembly in which all were equal and in which all could take part, even if they could also volunteer for other offices. So the equal citizenship and rights of citizens were protected, despite the existence of positions of power and responsibility, which could be filled only by a few people at any one time. Nowadays, however, there is no such politically preeminent body in which all citizens can assemble as equals. Some other way, then, must be found to make plain the political equality of citizens, despite their differential access to political office. If the arguments against a secret ballot and mandatory voting are correct, against open voting and mandatory voting are correct, we can't solve this problem by forcing people to participate in sortition assemblies, apart from the hardships involved and the difficulty of ensuring that these are fairly shared. We've seen that voluntary participation is essential to a democratic conception of the rights and the duties of citizens. So the problem of seeing and treating each other as equal is particularly acute in our societies, insofar as the aim of citizen assemblies is to represent the interests of the general population rather than that of members. And we must therefore really be able to distinguish them from servants, however well paid and powerful, who've been forced to participate on our behalf. We've seen then that sortition, like election and appointment, can serve democratic purposes and express democratic values even if there's nothing inherently democratic about it at all. As we're now learning, the practice of representative democracy can accommodate direct democracy, including citizen-initiated referenda. Likewise, our notions of representative democracy are sufficiently capacious to accommodate sortition as well as elections and appointments when distributing political opportunities to citizens. I take all of this to be good news for democracy and our capacities to secure different forms of equality, liberty and solidarity, as well as other values. Democratic citizens should be able to deliberate on matters of public policy together, and they should have access to the best available evidence in order to do so. How else otherwise are we going to be able to see each other as political equals and as entitled to rule, not just to be ruled? While sortition assemblies are only one way to realise and affirm citizens' claims in this respect, they're a salutary contribution to the theory and practice of democracy. However, comparing democracy in ancient Athens to contemporary democracy is sobering as well as exhilarating. As we've seen, the relatively simple assumptions about democratic equality that made unweighted lotteries so democratically appealing are hard to square with the demands of equality in a world in which political rights can be held by women as well as by men, and in which there are no slaves to take care of the productive labour in the home and domestic work for us. So publicly recognising our equality is a much more complicated matter in the modern world than in the ancient. Nor are we helped by the fact that there's no ready equivalent to the Athenian assembly in which all could participate as legislators. So the question I wanted to end with is, can we perhaps rethink the ways in which we treat procedural equality so that we can start to find a way of actually representing ourselves as equal but diverse citizens, try to find some equivalent in the political arena of something like the rule that's transformed rape cases, or that could transform rape cases, in criminal law. As you may know, one of the standard assumptions was that we should look for the reasonable man. What would the reasonable man believe? And that was part of the procedures that were used to adjudicate rape cases. But that, after much feminist criticism, has been changed, at least in many places, for an idea that actually we should also demand what the reasonable woman would have consented to. And that changes in this procedure to reflect our diversity are essential to limiting the gap between procedural equality on the one hand and equality of outcome on the other, even when we don't know what that equality would be. It seems to me what we now need to try and think of in the political arena is the equivalent of that sort of rule, a way of thinking about procedural equality that actually recognises our diversity as well as our unity, and that limits the gap between procedural equality and substantive equality. I don't know that we have any at present, but I'm happy to make some suggestions afterwards. One thing I thought was that actually we've seen that having assemblies that look like us is democratically appealing, even when we know that this has nothing to do with equality of opportunity. So perhaps then we should take mirror representation, however imperfect, as a guide to procedural equality in the political realm, rather than as at present treating it purely as justified by a form of equality of outcome. We've seen those arguments don't work. And if we do that, perhaps, we will end up with a conception of procedural equality that actually does speak to our democratic intuitions about the importance of representing us all, even though, as we know, it's not going to be consistent with other forms of equality. So I thought I'd just end on that note, a suggestion that there are ways of thinking about procedural equality that are different, that apply to sortition, appointment and elections, but that may give us a much more compelling conception of what it is to treat each other as equal than the two ways we've mainly used at present, giving everyone the same opportunities, either in voting or in sortition, or trying to create assemblies that represent groups equally. Thank you.